This episode is about Native America today, not in the textbook, not in old photos, and not in romanticized or simplified portrayals that are often found in the media, but real, living, and thriving communities right now in 2025. In the region known as Arizona, the Pascua Yaqui people have called this land home since time immemorial. The relationship to place is not only historical, it's active and enduring. The story has not ended. It is still being written. And yet, when we talk about Native Americans in this country, the conversation often framed in the past tense, as if everything meaningful already happened, as if indigenous identity is something frozen in time rather than present, evolving, and alive. So today, I want to speak with someone who lives in the intersection of tradition, identity, education, and everyday experiences. Someone who can speak not just from the past, but to what it means to be native in the present, navigating culture, community, and the expectations of mainstream American society all at the same time. Today, we'll talk about representation or the absence of it. We'll talk about the disconnect between narrative and reality. We'll explore what life looks like on and off reservation lands, how identity is understood and passed forward, and what cultural resilience looks like. And lastly, we'll discuss what it means to be a Native woman leading in educational spaces that were never designed with Indigenous people in mind. The intention here is not to generalize because Native American is not one story. It's thousands of tribes, stories, languages, histories, and lived experiences. But today, we're listening to one. And through that, we're hoping to understand a little bit more. So, off the record, but definitely in my mind, let's begin. So today, beautiful people, you're joined by someone who I deem to be very, very special. She's a colleague, a friend, a mother, an educator, an administrator, and currently serves as the vice chair of the Ventura County Indian Ed Consortium. She goes by many names, but I call her Miss Calles, Miss Shelley Calles. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you? Thank you for
I'm
having
doing
me.
I'm doing well. Thank you for agreeing to this. I've been really, really thinking about this over the last week for a myriad of reasons. But one, because, I've had a real life experience and I've seen you in action as an educator. I recall walking into your classroom for the very, very first time at a school that you and I both taught students at. And it was a fifth grade U.S. history class. And I was coming from an eighth grade U.S. history framework. So that was my first time walking into a fifth grade U.S. history class and just seeing how your whole environment was and seeing how the children were welcomed and it was a welcoming space. It was Miss Kaya's class, but out the gate it just felt like it was everyone's class. And I remember the look on your face and you smiled when I first remarked and called your classroom a habitat. You remember that?
Yes, I remember.
Yeah, I mean, I pride myself on being very wordy and very witty, but I mean, that was the first word that came to mind because it was everything was alive in your classroom and everything was organic. And I didn't really spend a lot of time over in the 300 building, over in the K through 5 experience coming from the middle school and ultimately from the high school experience. But I
Right.
remember walking into your classroom and I just knew that these students, our students at that point in times were in wonderful hands. And so, we joked about it, we laughed, and you allowed me to come in and to see you in action. And it really, really left a lasting mark on my mind. And so when I was thinking about this particular topic, like you were the first person to come to mind. So thank
Oh,
you for honoring us with your presence, and hopefully you'll feel comfortable. This is a safe space. I don't ask leading questions. I try to just lay it out there so that my curiosities and some of the curiosities that others who have known about this particular conversation have asked me to kind of consider and ask. And then also with the great help of, AI being able to generate some real, real tangible and juicy questions. I plan on just, presenting you with an opportunity to just share your thoughts and your experiences. I'm not sure to what degree you have an expertise, but you've lived
right.
on both sides of this coin, being an American and then also belonging to an indigenous tribe. And so anything that you posit today, we're all going to be winners and we're all going to be better off for having heard. So thank you. Just take it for what it is and allow us to just take a journey through your mind.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. I just want to say Luos M China, which is like greetings in my language. I'm like you said, I'm Pascua Yaqui. I'm an enrolled member of that tribe from Arizona through my father's side. So yeah, I have that experience of both sides of the world because my mom is, of European descent. So I don't like the term half and half, right? But I've grown up with it and I've learned to navigate, that sort of world of half and half or in between or whatever you want to call it. So,
Yeah. Okay, so this, the best place to always start is at the origin story, right?
mhm,
So, to whatever degree you feel comfortable, kind of share with us what it was like being a young girl growing up in the environment you grew up in, and
mhm,
how when and how you were able to navigate between those two worlds, or if there were more worlds, more intersectionality that kind of overlap with that. Just kind of share what it was like from your earliest memories to say 18 years old.
okay. So yeah, so being young, I grew up here where I now am an educator, I'm an administrator now, but I was a teacher for, over 20 years in this community where I grew up. So it's been nice to see the growth here. For me as a child growing up, I didn't really understand so much the native roots like I do now, obviously, but even back then, the committee I'm a part of, the Ventura Indian Ed Consortium, I was part of it as a student. And back when I was a student, anybody who identified as Native American could be a part of the program and get the lessons and get the free tutoring. So I wasn't an enrolled member at that time when I was younger, but my father obviously knew that we were Native American and he got me into the program, which I'm very grateful for. So I've been able to, be a part of this program even as a child. And now my kids are in it and now I'm a part of the committee. So it's amazing being able to just, share that with other Native, students in our community. But so as a child, they pull you out for a lesson and you learn about, native cultures and practices. And it might not always be your tribe. Like this year, we're doing Alaskan natives. So, every year they do a little bit different lessons. So I remember even as a child pulling out of my class and, learning about it. And I was always very intrigued by it. Like one of my dad's favorite movies was like Dances with Wolves, right? And, a lot of people know that. And I always kind of felt I don't know, a certain way about it. I always felt like a connection to it. I'm like, oh, is that what, being Native American is like? And that's like, even now today, like you're saying, it's not just what it used to be or in pictures or right. But back then I was like, oh, that's what it's like, the teepees and, all of that. So, just now, like looking back, I'm like, wow, that's where I came from. And now, I obviously am more educated and know more things, but I've always been, I've always felt, that connection to my Native American background. And for a while, my paternal grandmother lived with us, and she was full Yaqui. So being able to have her in our home, not my whole childhood, but a good part of it up until her passing, and just having that connection with her, seeing like the resilience of a strong Native woman, like, she had raised 7 kids and they always had hard times, it was not easy back then that they lived. My dad grew up in Arizona and we have a lot of family who lives there and lives on the reservation even today. But just having that connection with her, I've always felt like she's been there with me even now. She passed away when I was 13, but I had that connection with her where I got to live with her and learn from her. And so that's a good memory, a core memory of mine from when I was young. Um, all the way up until high school, I would do the lessons, I would get free tutoring. I wish I would have taken more advantage of the free tutoring that they offered, but now there's even more programs, for our youth that are, Native American. So I appreciate that. But yeah, just having my dad, he would always say things like, "Oh, we're real Indians." And I'm like, "What does that mean?" Or he would say like, "Oh yeah, your grandma's the last of the Mohicans." He would say all these little things, to me. And I'm like, so it was always kind of there. And he always, wanted to become an enrolled member. So I'm glad that we got to the point. It was a lot of digging, a lot of looking through paperwork, but we finally became enrolled about, I would say about 7 or 8 years ago now. But so I was happy that my dad was able to become an enrolled member of our tribe before he passed. And so that was really special to me to be able to go to the reservation and get our tribal cards together. And so, yeah, so that's kind of how that came about. But yeah, just as a young girl, I always had that connection. I still to this day, if people come into my home or my classroom, I always have, dream catchers and things like that. I have a mandala that I had since I was a child, which is similar to a dream catcher. In Native American culture, a lot of things are circle, dream catchers, the drum is circle, even at powwows, it's, they dance in a circular area, like circles are very meaningful to Native American people. So I still have that, in my home today. And it's from when I was a child. And I just remember when my grandmother passed away, I was 12 years old. And, I had family come from Arizona. And, whenever someone passes away, they either, make a dream catcher or a mandala and they bring it and they place it on their coffin. And so that was very symbolic to me, just like seeing that and, seeing the family come from our home basically and being there to support when that happened. So those are some of the memories I have of like my Native American culture from when I was younger.
Excellent, excellent.
Mhm.
And again, walking into your classroom, seeing that you had dream catchers up, is one of those things that you walk into, classrooms, and yes, as classroom teachers, we try to make our classroom a part of our identity, but then also part of it is to kind of represent the culture that we're serving, the
Right.
stakeholders that we're in contact with, and
Hmm.
so you don't walk into that many classrooms and see dream catchers. And so that was what tipped me off to the fact that you were not, I was under the impression that you're Hispanic just because of the last name, you know what I mean?
Right.
And that
Uh-huh.
was one of the things that stood out. And I remember asking you about it and you were, very forthcoming. And I was like, this is awesome that the
Yeah.
students get a chance to have that because I know that you represent yourself in the classroom and that they get that part of you as long as in addition to the educational space. So
Right.
the thing that is burning in the back of my mind and has been burning in the back of my mind for a long time. I haven't been able to really get a clear cut understanding of my own. We know as educators that Columbus thought he was traveling to India and landed in a whole nother hemisphere in a whole continent
Right.
and thought that the indigenous peoples were Indios and thus coined that phrase Indios,
Hmm.
which became Indian. What
Yeah.
I've wondered for the longest time is why is it that some indigenous peoples tribes allow themselves to be referred to and even call themselves Indian
Hmm.
while others say, no, we are indigenous and we want to cast off those shackles, so to speak,
Right.
of colonialism. So,
Right.
in your title, vice chair of Ventura County of Indian Education, it has the word
Hmm.
Indian in it. And so,
Yes.
is there a derogatory kind of feel to it, or is it? Walk us through just from your perspective and what you've
Right.
been able to glean from it. What's the difference between indigenous and Indian?
Well, I feel yes, some people do have that stigma to it still, like, oh, we're not Indians and, we prefer indigenous or native. And I think I don't know if eventually it'll be kind of like taken away, but it's still used today, obviously, like in our committee. And we have had those discussions about changing it. It's something that we have to vote on as a committee and it has to be approved. And it's like a whole process. And it's always been called that, right? So, and you still hear things like, oh, this is Indian land. So a lot of natives still use the word Indian. Like my dad would use it. And I think it was just, you know, the language, it is starting to like, I would say like fade away. And even with like the new things with the companies and the sports teams taking away, the things like the Indians or the natives on their, either their mascot or
Logos.
their
Yeah.
logos or,
Hmm.
and so I think eventually it might be something that people are turned away from using, but it's still used like in our textbooks even, right? So you teach history, right? The California Indians, it's still, they still use it. So I wouldn't say it's derogatory. Yes, the way it came about, excuse me, is, not something that I would say like, oh, we're proud of it, but I think some people have wanted to take it back. Like we are Native, we are Indian, and they want to like, I don't want to say own it. That's not the right word, but they do want to take it back and not make it, be like we're being owned by something or someone or an idea, right? So I think that's why a lot of people do prefer Indigenous or Native American, but I people still use it, and yes, people don't like it. So I think there is going to be a time where it's not used as much, but to this day it's still being used. And I don't know. The way I feel about it is because I grew up hearing that word, it's not like derogatory towards me, I don't feel like. And what does sometimes bother me, they're like, well, what kind of Indian are you? Are you
Yeah.
India Indian or Indian like Native American? Sometimes people are like, what kind when I say, when people say, oh, you're part of the Indian Ed, like what is that? So I
Yeah.
think it's just, you know, informing people, I guess, like it's okay to use it if you're not using it in a derogatory manner, right?
Yeah. So as you know, I teach, I have the privilege of teaching ethnic studies here in Southern California, and the term reclamation is used, and that's kind of like what you're talking about. There's a decision made on how peoples are going to reclaim their identities and what they're going to
Yeah.
accept versus what was kind of like, heaped upon them.
Yeah.
And I find myself in that uncomfortable space, not necessarily on a daily basis, but whenever we're talking about Native Americans, like I tell my students that I refer to them as Indigenous or Native American, just out of
Mhm.
respect. I personally have never really
Right.
felt comfortable with calling someone Indian, only because just thinking about it, anytime that I saw someone referred to someone that looked like you or was from, an indigenous background, calling them Indian, it was in a condescending way. It was in the cowboys and Indians kind
Right.
of way, or some of the other words that come along with saying, I felt like Indian was a gateway to kind of start saying other stuff that was very culturally insensitive. So me being not at all, privy to the culture, but understanding being also another marginalized group of people and understanding the nuances between whether you call someone like me black versus African American, I've always just felt like, well, if the curriculum for the most part says indigenous and Native American people, or they'll say American Indians as it relates to like the Inuit or up in the Alaska area, I just always felt a little bit out of sorts in front of students referring to people that look
Right.
like you as Indian. So I've always thought about that. I've always been like,
Mhm.
because, that's something that all minority groups have had to deal with in this country because certain words were kind of like thrown upon you. And now we live in a space where, yeah, we can reclaim and make these things ours again. So thank you for that insight and for being able to share that. Whenever I did searches, historical accounts, looking through like archives, and it always pretty much, for the most part, says something along the lines that because of the way in which the laws and the treaties were made with the United
Mhm.
States government and indigenous groups, if you don't use the word Indian, it kind of convolutes the conversation when you're talking about legalities, when you're talking about ceded lands, and you're talking about these different
Mhm.
governmental agencies that were set up within the Department of the Interior to deal with Native American people. So it always came from a standpoint that just to not say the word Indian means, so then now when you see the law and it's said throughout the laws and statutes and treaties, and it's like, well, who are you talking about? Because they're saying they're indigenous, but all this framework says Indian. And that further kind of made me feel like that sucks. It's just a reminder. So I'm glad to be able to hear from your perspective that it's something sounds to me like it's something that at least you all have a decision to make and are in the process of making that decision.
Yeah.
So that's amazing. Okay, so I want to dig a little bit deeper into representation, and we kind of remarked about it super quick offline, and so this is the perfect time to place this. Not so long ago, a few weeks ago, we celebrated what was called Indigenous Peoples Day here in America, and then under our current administration, all of a sudden on the calendars and all that stuff, it went back to Columbus Day. If
Yeah.
you don't mind sharing, whatever you feel comfortable with sharing on the matter without getting too political, what is your thoughts on it now going back to Columbus Day?
Well, for me, it was very devastating. I felt like, you know, you know, from our past, administration, it was nice to finally be recognized and, get that sort of, you know, I don't know, like just I guess recognition, that, we were here first and, and it's just too bad that, the new administration felt that they needed to, take that back, so to speak, and, call it Columbus Day. And um for me it was a sad thing to hear. And it was, on the news. I follow a lot of Native American influencers, and it was not taken lightly. We're still celebrating. I still supported and wear my indigenous jewelry and clothing that day. So it was sad. It was a sad thing for me, and I think for indigenous people everywhere. It 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 hurt pretty bad, I would say. And it's too bad that they felt that they needed to change it back, so to speak. And after we felt like we had that big win, with the previous administration with that. So that's my thought on that.
No, thank you for sharing that. And I don't mind adding to that to be 100% transparent with you. Did not know that he had changed the name back. And going into this last little kind of build up to it, talking with students and saying, hey, we're not going to be in school because it's Indigenous Peoples Day.
Mhm.
And they were like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And I'm like, you young people, I'm looking at them like they're crazy. I'm like, you young people are
Right.
still living in the past. I know this is a history class, but you guys
Right.
don't understand that this is not Columbus Day. This is Indigenous Peoples Day. And they're like, well, this says Columbus Day on the calendar. And I
Yeah.
said, you know what? I remember. I was like, hold on, because what I'll usually do because in this new generation's world, if it didn't happen on TikTok or if it didn't happen on IG, it didn't happen. So I
Right.
always stop what I'm doing and I'll fact check myself, just to make sure. And
Mhm.
most of the time, I mean, most of the time, I'm spot on, and it's a learning opportunity for them. But I remember
Yeah.
going, deviating, pausing the lesson, going and getting on my computer and looking up in the calendar, just a regular United States calendar. And sure enough, it said darn Columbus Day on it. And you know what I said as there's two things I said when I walked back up to the front of the class. The
Mhm.
first thing I said, you know what? I say this to you all in this time. I'm more interested in being correct and not being right. So when I
Right.
find out that I'm in error, like I owe it to you all and to the integrity of my position here as the historian in the room to be able to say, okay, I made a mistake and maybe even talk about how we make mistakes. Because if I can own my mistakes, then you guys can feel comfortable making your own. But
Right.
then I followed up, I said, but still, I'm not calling it freaking Columbus Day. It's Indigenous Peoples Day. This
Same.
guy would be out of office. This guy would be out of office in like 4 years. So I'm not saying it as Columbus Day, right?
Yeah.
And
Thank you. I
so
appreciate that.
yeah, because as I've I'm almost at 50 years strong on this planet. I still got a couple more years, and
Mhm.
sometimes I feel like I'm in a race to get to 50 just so I can just say I've been living half a century. But
Right.
the older that I've gotten, the more I've been convinced that the way that we kind of change the future is kind of balancing out, calling out what the past was while at the same time showing what things have been done to progress to make
Mhm.
these changes. So we don't have to hang our hats on what Columbus did and how he systematic his landing in modern what he called Hispaniola, how that devastated the Western Hemisphere. We don't have to hang on that because now we have a way to recognize the positive and negative impacts, and then kind of give it back to the natives by saying, okay, we're still going to recognize this day, but we'll call it Indigenous Peoples Day. And I just felt like that was just so cool that that happened, you know. And I think that those kind of things makes it easier to digest the atrocities that happened in the past when we can show we're making progress. But here
Right.
we have this current administration that just pulled us back to
Exactly.
1492, and that
Yeah.
part kind of sucked.
Yes, it did.
Okay, so let's continue to kind of think about how Native peoples are represented outside of their own advocacy, right? So how do you feel that Native Americans are represented in mainstream American culture today, whether it's media, education, politics, or social conversations? Because I've already shared with you, I just feel like Native Americans are spoken about in past tense in
Yeah.
many things, but like they're no longer around. So now that you're part of that inner world and you live in that duality, what do you see from the inside looking out?
Well, I think it's definitely gotten better. We still have a long way to go, right? We have new shows and movies and things coming out, and then, whenever there's anyone in political power who's Native American, they're like, "Oh, the first Native American congressperson," or, so I mean, those things are being noticed. I just want to get to the point where it's not, "Oh, it's the first," and it's like we should this is our community too. Like we should be a part of all those things, political realm, the social media, all those things, right? There's newer, like the reservation dogs, there's, the North of North, like there's a lot of shows that are showing, natives more modern, because like we're saying, we're used to like pictures and old stories and things like that, which is great. We don't want to lose that, we don't want to lose where we came from, our heritage, our ancestors, all those things. But, we live in this world today. Like here I am, I'm an educator, I'm an administrator, and it's kind of like our job now, like our ancestors have given us this opportunity now to like pass it on to the next generation, right? And that's why I try to be, proactive in my community, with my students, with my staff. There's a professional development coming up for teachers, and I'm going to promote it to all my friends and people that it's free, and there's lessons, and we're trying to move away from doing the mission projects. Like that's like no more, right? So what else can we do in our classrooms and our schools to, make everyone aware, and kids who are native who might not have someone in their life who, is proactive in the community, or, teaches them about their culture. How can we teach them? We're literally sitting on Chumash land here. Like this, this whole, North America's Turtle Island. Like people forget, like this is, native land. And we have the opportunity as educators, as parents, as, people in our community to spread, awareness that, we are still here, we're resilient, we're still here, our people are still here, and, we don't want to lose that, as, time goes on and they call us like, the melting pot, and, as children become, less and less, 100%, I'm a quarter and then my kids are less, and it goes less and less. We don't want to lose that. So it's kind of like our job. We're like, the people who are gonna pass it on to the next generation. Hopefully that generation will pass it on. So I like the fact that, there's shows on TV that we can watch. There's movies. I had the pleasure of meeting Eric Hernandez, who is a hoop dancer. He was with Circus Soleil, and he came to our Indian Ed Consortium honoring ceremony, which we have every year at the end of the year. He came and spoke and did a dance, and it's just so healing, like to hear the music of native people, to see the dance, even if you're not native, just like seeing like those things, it just, it brings all these emotions, and it's a beautiful thing. And I hope that we never lose that. It's great that people like him and other people, he just made a movie called Courage, and it's about his life, about how, he grew up to be a hoop dancer. He's just a normal kid from, out here, and his uncle taught him the hoop dance, and he did it at a school event, like a cultural event. And then, they started calling him the Lord of the Rings because they thought it was the coolest thing. And then he said the next year when they had a cultural event, they had to make it a 2-day thing because there were so many kids who wanted to share their culture. And it's like people like him, and you know, um, all these activists and people like, there's a Native American model, Kwana, who does a lot of work and she's beautiful and she's in the magazines, but she's also an activist. There's just all these people who are doing good things for, our culture and our people. And I hope that, that doesn't ever die out. That's, I guess, my fear as, a Native American person is that I don't ever want all of the beautiful things of our culture to go away.
Yeah. And by the way, thank you for sending me that clippage from the hoop dance. I don't
Oh,
know if you remember or not, but you
yes,
sent
I
me
sent that to
that
you.
YouTube video and I looked at
Mhm.
that. I showed my students that,
Oh,
we
awesome.
yeah,
Yeah.
we were not in a section of the curriculum where we were dealing with, Native American experience. We were still maybe about maybe 3 weeks out as far as content wise, but
Mhm.
stuff like that is just so powerful. And I know
Yes.
that I talk to them a lot about how we are influenced by images way more than words,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
And what we see time in and time out is what kind of is etched in our brain and how we tend to associate things. And it doesn't necessarily come from a negative place. It's
Right.
children that you're a K through 5 educator. As a child going to kindergarten, they have to learn their shapes and they have to learn the
Right.
colors and they have to learn
Hmm.
the numbers and all these things that help us to develop this way to kind of got to categorize and to kind of stereotype things. And that's a huge part of learning. It's just when we start sprinkling in those microaggressions and those biases that things,
Right.
kind of take a terrible turn. But you've opened up an avenue for me to kind of like ask this next question because I grew up in the African American community in the hood, and
Right.
we would hear Native American or Indian, vice
Right.
versa. And at
Hmm.
the schools that I went to, there would be one or two or something like that. But all of the socialization that I got from Indigenous people is what we saw on TVs, and you see the
Right.
advertisements to be a cowboy with the pop gun, and you have the Indian with the headdress.
Right.
And so I think that if I just were to do a random little question, if I stood out on an average street corner like Jimmy Kimmel and the greats do, and I'm like, hey, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you hear Native American or Indian? I think if people feel comfortable enough to share in that context, it would
Yeah.
be the generalized headdress or the moccasins or, any
Right.
of those things that are just kind of like, in my opinion, have become caricatures of the
Right.
greater rich culture you have. My question to you is, what does it mean to you to live in your identity day to day? How is it different from how people assume native identity shows up?
Um, I think a lot of people are surprised that I'm Native American. But I feel like a sense of course, pride of being Native, and a lot of people are, aware, like my coworkers and my friends and people I associate myself with know, and they'll ask me questions, and I'm very open on my social media. I share things like about Native Americans, or if I go to a powwow or things like that, I'm very open about it. So I think that gives an opening to people to come to me and ask me questions and not feel like, you know, like I'm gonna think they're doing something, bad or something. Like I feel like I'm pretty open about it, and I feel like just in this day and age, it's good to have, that outlet to be able to like talk about my culture, talk about, Native Americans in general. And, we're doing something now at a lot of the school districts because most of the school districts in our county are part of our consortium, and we're doing land acknowledgements now. So I don't know if you've listened to a school board meeting lately. I don't know. But a lot of them are now doing the land acknowledgements, which is amazing because, like I said, this is Chumash land. We are here, we're on their land. And so I think it's great that we're doing things like that to make people aware that maybe aren't aware, or even like you're saying, like the young people who don't know that this is, a Native American land here. So it's great that those things are being incorporated, and I really do push for those things in my community and in my school district. I try to be a part of all of those things, the events, and the planning of those things. So I feel like you know I do have a purpose, and being in the position that I am, that I can you know be a part of that change, the movement, or whatever you want to call it. But just, you know, reminding people of, you know, where we're at and who we are and, you know, that we're still here, we're resilient, we're still here, we're all still here. So it's a big thing for me.
Thank you for sharing that because
Yeah.
it kind of helps me as an educator. Again, you know, one of my many tasks with dealing with introducing our beloved ninth grade students to the field of ethnic studies, the land acknowledgement piece is something that is still optional as a opening for each and every class session, or is at least recommending as you're starting to do the you know first 3 or 4 weeks of trying to create community and you know create a safe space within the classroom. But I
Right.
have to be honest in saying that I've really felt uneasy about the land acknowledgement piece, and here's why. Reading line for line what it says and totally recognizing and understanding that in this day and age it needs to be reintroduced back into our major mainstream concept of America, that there were peoples, there were hundreds of thousands, if not millions of peoples already deposited here in the Americas prior to European colonization. I
Right.
could appreciate the fact that there's time being taken out to acknowledge that you all have existed. But where just personally for me, and the reason why I became a historian is because when I grew up, like there really wasn't a such thing as a representation of marginalized people's voices, you know?
Right.
And so when I saw things in history, it was always from a European lens and it always annoyed me. And so what I thought immediately after the first time I heard the land acknowledgement, it was at a PD. And I thought this is so cool. But then it was like, okay, so but what happens next? You know,
Right.
now we've acknowledged that the lands were stolen in many cases, and in best case
Mhm.
scenario, they were ceded and there was negotiations and efforts to make peace in the region.
Right.
But we still are moving around in this big conglomerate called the United States of America. And on a day-to-day basis, I don't see indigenous representation outside of being close to a Native American reservation. And that part still bothers me. And it still kind of, you know, hardens my heart a little bit because I'm like, okay, we're at the step where we're acknowledging these things. And me on the outside looking in, I get to participate and do my part. I get to make our students aware of the rich cultures,
Right.
multicultures that are around them. But then they, in all of their, you know, very, very limited and novice understanding of the world, are like, but there's still Walmart they down the street. Or are
Right.
they ever going to get a land back? Or
Right.
my dad said that they all they do on the Chumash reservation is gamble at the casino. I still have to field that, you know, that side of their curious questions. And I'm like, you know,
Mm.
out of the mouth of the babes, the Bible says out of the mouth of the babes, you know, young
Right.
people they'll speak the truth. So it's like we're doing all these things to help to highlight and illuminate the fact that you all are here and will hopefully be here to stay for as long as the lands are your lands. But I don't see the legislation side really, uh, I don't know if the proper term is giving back resources or giving back land. Do you know just from, you know, your current position, is that kind of stuff going on here in California where there's still conversations about possibly redistributing, redrawing up territories and things of that nature?
Yeah, I feel like there has been talk about it, but like, you know, that's the other problem, right? Is like even the Chumash are not federally, some of the, because there's different bands of Chumash and some of them aren't even federally recognized. Like this last year, the last school year, we lost, you know, funding for a lot of our students because we get federal funding and we get funding from school districts for our program, for the Indian Ed program. And we lost, you know, so many students because they're like, oh, well, they're not federally recognized, so we are not going to give you money for those students. So luckily the school districts in our county stepped up and we're like, no, we're not going to make them, you know, exit the program. This is like their land and we're learning, you know, things about their culture and they're not going to be a part of it, you know. So it's still a fight. It's unfortunate. Yes, there's some places like I know in Oregon and things like that, they're trying to, you know, give names back, like the native places and lands, their native names back and things like that. And they're, you know, they're trying to make the efforts, I think, to, you know, give back to the people. But I think it's a long fight, and I don't know. Honestly, we need to look at, the administration and what's coming, and Congress, and who's going to be, making those decisions. And unfortunately, like, I don't see them ever being able to completely heal or fix what's happened. But I feel like there are some strides, where they're like making an effort to, at least let people have a say. They're now turning to the native elders to like ask, questions, and what are the next steps, right? I mean, I don't know. I really don't know. Unfortunately, I just feel like it's been an uphill fight, and it's just never, I don't think it's gonna ever get easier, honestly, until, some things change.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I guess a little sliver of well, I don't want to say sliver. I guess here's where the optimism lies, we're gonna be getting a new governor at some
Mhm.
point.
Yeah.
Governor Gavin Newsom's two-term tenure is up.
Yeah.
So the state of California is gonna have a new governor, and that's an opportunity to really, really make a big impact. But again, with the next presidential election, whoever comes in, the Department of the Interior is gonna get a whole new facelift.
Mhm.
And just like you had mentioned earlier, this concerted effort to kind of acknowledge the fact that there are some injurious or some very, very derogatory ways in which indigenous peoples have been represented in sports and by companies and in jingles and all those
Right.
things. The fact that now corporations are taking responsibility for that
Mhm.
again because they understand with all these marketing dollars going towards how do you market your product, they understand the impact on marketing to say, okay, let's at least remove these microaggressions and these things. That's great. But I want to take this time to kind of like move into your particular tribe, in
Mhm.
particular, because you had alluded to the fact that you and your father had the opportunity to go and to, get your paperwork together and to go get your tribal membership and all the recognition, all the great things that go along with that. For a
Mhm.
second, talk to us about how you felt. What was your thoughts when you all, I assume you traveled, whether by plane or car, to the
Mhm.
reservation and went through this
Yeah.
whole process? What was that like for you and your father?
Oh, you're gonna make me cry. It was great, like, it was a long process, like I said. A lot of my cousins and aunts and uncles and family members, like, they had to do a lot of digging, because back in the day, when my grandmother was born, it was you're either white or black, right, on your birth certificate. So her birth certificate said white, and so like having to rectify all the paperwork to like figure out like how far back it went. And it just so happened that, one of my dad's cousins was living on the reservation, and that's kind of how we were able to, get in, into the tribe at that time. Was that we all had to go do our paperwork, bring, all our birth certificates, do all the things. And it was just, of course, a lot of work, but worth it, because it was so prideful to be like, oh, I'm finally recognized. So I can't imagine like the tribes that are not federally recognized, like how that would feel, because it was very like prideful and happy. And it was an amazing thing, because my dad was like, oh, now we're real Indians, like kind of like making a joke, but it was very prideful for him. Like, he showed us like around, because he's from Tucson, Arizona, and that's where, our tribe is from. And he showed like, oh, this is the high school I went to. This is, I got to meet aunts and uncles and cousins, and we got to go to the reservation and, see that sort of life, how that is on the reservation. We've been back a few times, but being there with my dad, and my brother, we got to go together, and just, that feeling of like pride, I guess. I mean, that's the best way I could put it, is like that's what, I think we all felt. And it was a sweet, sweet day. And, just, I don't know, being there on that land, and unfortunately, since my dad has passed away, so I did take some of his ashes back there, and, so that part of him could be on that land, because that's like where he grew up, where he came from. That's, so, yeah, so a pride, I guess, is probably the best word I could say. And, just having that with my dad and my brother and the rest of our family, it was beautiful. So,
Nice,
Yeah.
nice. So full transparency, full disclosure. I've only had two types of interactions with Indian reservations. As a
Mhm.
child, uh every other year or so, there was always someone in the community or one of my friends,
Mm,
parents or something that would take us there during the 4th of July time period to go buy fireworks because in the city limits and I've moved all around the West Coast and even in the East
right.
Coast. But most of my upbringing was in the West Coast, from California to Washington State and everywhere in between. The native reservations, made manufactured fireworks and sold them. That was a part of their local economy during that time. And it was
Mhm.
legal to like pop fireworks there on the reservation, whereas in the city, it was illegal. So I only got a glimpse just going on to the actual reservation itself to get fireworks and the
Mhm.
exit. My only other interaction, in all honesty, was to go to a casino of some
Mhm.
sort
Right.
there. And so I know for a fact that it does not at all give me it didn't afford me an opportunity to even see what the
Okay.
reservation looked like in the daytime or the full layout. So since you've been back and forth to your tribal reservation, can you just share very briefly or however long you want to kind of hover over it, what is life like on a reservation for someone who is part of the reservation versus if I went there now, I would forever be a tourist. I would be that person that's coming just to kind of look on the outside looking in. But since you're
Mhm.
a card carrying member, so to speak, what is the reservation life look like in 2025?
Well, it's gotten a lot better even in the last, 10 years, especially on our reservation. They've built a lot of newer homes and it's not as um it's just a lot more modern now. Before, like the first time I went there, a little over 10 years ago, it was kind of run down and just what you might think a reservation would look like from like movies and stuff, like just like chain link fence, just kind of dogs just everywhere and like just not the, the best thing to see. Like, when you first go, you're like, oh, this is what it is. Like I remember my first time was like, oh, but, they've made so many like improvements and, they have like health centers there now, schools, like, they're trying to make it better, like building more modern type homes instead of like, the flat like homes, kind of like what you would see like in the projects or something, like those just like rectangular homes that are all like the same size, and they all look the same. So a lot of
Right.
the homes that are there from like the original time, that's how they kind of look, is just that rectangular, just simple, like, big backyard open with chain link fence, and now they're making them more like modern homes and it's a lot nicer to look at. They have like, like I said, like their own health centers, they have their own fire departments, their own police departments. So like they're making it more of like a more modern community, if that makes sense. There's like
Yeah.
we have to go to the enrollment center there, like whenever we have to update things or, when we had to go take our pictures for our tribal cards, things like that. And you can see things like from the past, right? They have, it's kind of like a mini museum in there where there's different things and artifacts and paintings and stuff, but then you also see the modern side of it where they're trying to make it, modern and clean and like how things should be now, right? Like
Yeah.
with the funding and things. And our tribe, they do have a casino. And I have stayed at the hotel there and it's nice, it's beautiful, it's a nice place to go, but that's not what it's only about. It's nice that we have that. It offers jobs, to people, from our community and, for our people and, so that's a good thing. And I don't know, it's just it is becoming a lot more modern and nicer, but definitely there's still a lot of work to do, I think, because there are still some of those, like homes that you're like, oh, this is how people are living, but
Yeah. Yeah, and I asked that because my only real references comes from either the academia side or the handful of documentaries that I've watched on, the topic. And the documentaries point out, I guess the other side of what you're saying has been changing and what's been cleaning up. I can't think, I don't think I've viewed a documentary about Native American or tribal life on an actual reservation without, coming from the experience being very, very saddened by it and just feeling like, man, that's terrible that these things still persist. Like,
Mhm.
I'm a lifelong learner, so I read, a lot of stuff and just realizing that women's, health and
Mhm.
women's safety on reservations has been something that's been illuminated a lot in the last like 5, 10 years of how
Mhm.
bad it was there. And, I hear, just being that bystander, hear people that pass judgment and say, hey, you know what? Reparations for you all have been locked and sealed and signed and should be off the table. They gave you all the ability to create casinos, and now they're billion-dollar ventures. So now you all should be able to, clean up your own environment and make it whatever it is that the reservation should be. And sometimes I feel like that's an insensitive thing to say because
Right.
sure, to say now you give people back something that was taken from them, which is the means to be able to provide for themselves and to be able to have their own identity and determine for themselves what their environment is going to look like. I always just have trouble with that. Just being a historian and a lover of all things U.S. history. But it
Right.
sounds to me that if the modernization is taking place from your tribal councils and from the people that actually now can activate agency for themselves, and it's no longer,
Right.
like you said, projects is what we call them. The same
Yeah.
cookie cutter layout in
Yeah.
my community are called projects. And
Yes.
usually when you put projects out, it immediately takes away individuality because everyone's walking into the same, like you said, cookie cutter environment.
Mhm.
But then it also, like I said, the way that we see things visually do impact our spirit, impacts our mind, impacts how we think about ourselves. And if you're in a cookie cutter type of scenario that everything is run down, there's little to no resources, it
Mhm.
cannot promote a bunch of pride in who you are
Yeah.
on your tribal lands. So it's
Mhm.
great to hear that you're saying they're actually understanding that, like, that's a great first step is to make people's dwellings, a place where they can again be re-energized, and then you all can decide to what degree you want to modernize versus still hold on to cultural practices. So it's great that you shared that. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
Okay, so now I want to pivot to the intersectionality, okay? Because at the beginning, I introduced you as a colleague, as a friend, as a mother, as an educator, as an administrator,
Mhm.
and on the Indian Ed Consortium. Um, and so all those things are who you are and more. My question to you is, in your role as an educator or administrator, how do you integrate your indigenous ways of knowing, teaching, or leading on a day-to-day basis?
Mm, that's a good question. I feel like just being true to who I am, like um Native American people are very about their community, their and not just community like where they live, but their community like their people. And I think
Mhm.
like I have that's I think something I'm very proud of is that like my people are my people, my friends, like I have a lot of close friends, I have a lot of colleagues, I have and I feel like I do have that sense of I make people comfortable and I think even being an administrator, it was a little bit hard for me to leave the classroom and become an administrator just because I'm like, oh, those relationships, I don't want to lose those relationships with my colleagues. And I feel like I've tried to do a good job of having that open door policy or, where people feel comfortable coming to me, my colleagues, my staff feels comfortable talking to me or asking me if they need something. So I think just having those roots of community and wanting to do to do good things for my community for the my students for my colleagues. I want people to know that what I do is important. It's not just who I am, like you said, I'm all these things. I'm a mother, I'm Native American, I'm all of these things. But before that, I'm a human being and I love on people and I hope that people who are near me or around me see that, that's my goal is to just be happy, to make people happy, to have a life that, is fulfilled, and I feel like my job and my family and my friends and all those things that are important to me make me who I am. Growing up, my dad was, a single dad for a good part of my life. And he showed me that, just showing up for people, and I think that's what I try to do as a teacher, as a friend, as an administrator, as a mom. Like I show up, and I think that's, as a Native woman, being resilient, we have to show up for our people, and I think that kind of embodies who I am, like as a person, as a mom, as a friend, as a teacher, all those things. And I hope that people in my life see that. And I do feel that, like, I I do feel like people even in my, my workplace feel comfortable talking to me and asking me questions. And I feel comfortable also, like saying, hey, like I do share those videos. Like the one I shared with you, I shared it with our staff. We put it on our advisory calendar to show our students. And a lot of the teachers were like, oh my God, that's great. Thank you. Like I would have never like looked for that or known about that or, so I try to just be that person who, is a light and shines light on things that are important to me. And I think people see that.
Yes, I know. I definitely have gotten that from you in the time that we've spent together in the same school district. And so you've answered a portion of my next question. I just want to see if there's any more texture you can add to it. So the question is, are there moments you felt that you had to educate others simply to be understood? Which emphatically is yes. It's just part
Yeah.
of baked into, you walking around in mainstream America, where there's
Mhm.
not really a major and strong presence of indigenous peoples out in the streets, right? Or if they are, they're probably dressed in plain clothes, and so they're
Mhm.
not really seen that way. The second part is how do you decide when to take on that responsibility of representing Native Americans anywhere and everywhere, and when to just step back and let people just be who they're going to be?
Um, I mean, I'm not gonna obviously get in like heated arguments with people, but I will always stand up for, what's right, whether it's, Native American culture or anything else, I do feel like, I have had to have those hard conversations with colleagues about, things like the mission project. Like, we don't do that. We don't do those anymore. Like, they're like, oh, like I have had to have those hard conversations and but I always have something to back it up, right? Give them the history of why we don't do those things anymore, or what else we could do instead, right? I'm a problem solver and I don't want to just say no. Like even now in my position now, I'm not going to just say no, you can't do that. But what can we do instead, right? We got to have that growth
Mhm.
mindset, even as educators and as administrators. Like it's always like, what could we do instead, or what can we do to make people and our students more aware. We do a lot of cultural things and, it's good, like, to have the students see that there's other things, because there's some students who never leave this little city that we live in, they don't know that there's a whole big world out there or what the world was before, so and I do have a good relationship with, the social studies teachers. And it's too bad we did have an ethnic studies class and we don't anymore at the site I'm at currently. We did. And, it's something I would really like to see come back, and because I think it is important to have, classes like that for our students.
Yeah, and here's where I'm gonna say what you're not at liberty to say.
Mm-hmm.
Being one of the individuals that was tasked with having that under my umbrella while in your school district, and
Mm-hmm.
then moving on to the next chapter in my life and hearing that of the measly three sites in which we were able to expand out the ethnic studies, that two of the three sites 1 year after me departing from the school district had collapsed. Like that really felt like a slap in the face to
Yeah.
myself having that under my umbrella, being the K through 8 history social studies TOSA while at the school district, but then also, a good friend and colleague, Maritza Avila, who actually is the one that has spearheaded actually doing the
Mhm.
underwriting and getting the approval to actually have that curriculum at your school district. Like it really, really was a missed opportunity to
Yeah.
actually get ahead of the curve here in Southern California because I have friends and Facebook friends from all over the country and all over the world that
Mhm.
can consume this and sit down and hear this. But in the state of California, ethnic studies is here to stay. It's one of the things that is not at all partisan. Now, how to roll it out and to what degree to utilize it as a high school requirement, those things are still very political.
Right.
But as a state, the acknowledgement that students, no matter what their ethnic background, no matter what their race or what their gender or any of those things are, should be able to have access to hearing voices um, that are from marginalized people's perspectives and not just the dominant mainstream U.S. History narrative, to not have students of color and white students to have access to sit and to understand that is going to continue to set back future generations. Because if the
Right.
question is, how do we become a post-race society? How do we get over this thing called race? And how do we get people to start looking at and feeling more like a human culture? And not necessarily just, different cultures. It starts with being able to have students engage critically what has happened and what has changed, and then that informs them to what further changes need to happen in the future. If we
Right.
go back to where we no longer are talking about that, except for in little pockets of social spaces and online, without having the academic piece, I don't think it can be used in a way in which students can digest it and understand, hey, we all have our own story, and we should be
Hmm.
interested in learning about our own stories and learning about other people's stories. If we're going to share this melting pot that you referenced earlier,
Hmm.
then we should have access to know what the ingredients are. Like,
Right.
I think that that's just simple. When you sit down with someone, you're getting ready to eat something, you put something in front of them, usually they'll ask you what's in it.
Yeah.
So if we're a culture, if we're a country full of multiculturalism, to
Right.
have a school system that doesn't share with the consumers and the stakeholders what are the ingredients of our country, how can you get us to start liking this country again? How can you get everyone to feel included again and
Right.
and to be able to step forward? So when I heard that, it did, yeah, it made me mad. At that first phone call I made, I called uh to the other colleague that I referenced and was like, "Did you hear what happened?" And she was like, "It's a damn shame." And I was like, "We did all that good work."
Yeah.
And it was supposed to just be the start, just the
Right.
seed that should have been watered. But I digress. I can go on about that. You just kind of triggered me when you
I'm
said that
sorry.
because that was something that,
Yeah.
that's something that, I cut my teeth with. I wouldn't
Yeah.
be in the position I'm in right now and of a great resource to the students that I service now, had I not had those 2 years in the district office looking at and figuring out how to actually expound on that and to cultivate that particular course. And then for it to be
Right.
gone, it's just like, ah. So
Yeah.
sorry about that. This is supposed to be about you, not about me. But it just kind of like,
Yeah, I hear you.
because there was a great opportunity and
Yeah.
the students deserve it. The students deserve to
Yeah.
hear,
Yes.
multiple ways to see this world around them. Okay, to get back on track. So, just kind of going back again to
Uh-huh.
your particular tribe, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
It, out of curiosity, have you uh passed on everything that you've gained, through your father and your experiences with your two sons? Have they went out to the reservation with you at all, or are
Yes.
they at all receptive to it? So talk about that a little bit. How does the tribe move forward through the next generation?
So right now we're kind of working on hopefully extending the lineage, because right now it's only goes up to a quarter, which is what I am. So my two boys are not enrolled members yet. But I mean, if you think about it, eventually like all the elders will be gone, and then it's going to be like the next generation. There's going to be no more enrolled members. So I'm hoping that the council will vote on, extending it to, more, with people with less percentage, because I would love to get my two boys enrolled, because there's a lot of opportunities, right? Like with scholarships and, funding for different things, like for buying a home or things like that, that they could, take advantage of, if they were enrolled members. Like even here, right? We have the Indian Health in Santa Barbara, like they do free, clinics and things like that for Native Americans, but my kids are not enrolled. So they're technically not, enrolled members. So I could go to the clinics. I can go to the different events like the Owens Valley has. I can go, do all those things, but I would really like my children to have, the benefits as well. So they have been to the reservation with me. It was an experience. They got to meet, some of my family that lives out there, and they got to see what it was like. And um, so I'm glad that they got to, experience that with me. And I hope that, one day that they'll get to go and get their tribal cards and be a part of it. But, my younger son was very involved in his Native American education. He still is. He's part of the consortium. He gets the pull out classes, and and this is his last year. He's a senior, so he'll get to be a part of that honoring ceremony this year where we honor our seniors, and they get blanketed by their families, and it's like a whole thing. It's beautiful. And actually, I just recently took him to get his senior pictures, and I got him his eagle feather. Actually, I have it back here behind me. But the people at the picture place were like, "Oh, like what is that?" And I said, "Well, it's an eagle feather and it's beaded with his school colors." And they're like, "Well, does it mean something?" And I said, "Yes, this is a big step for him. It's, acknowledging that, he's, come to a crossroad where he's, made this achievement. And so it's like an honoring thing." So they're like, "Oh, that's really neat." And so it was really beautiful to see that. It was sad that, like normally, like probably my dad would have presented it to him and it would have been, more, a little different, but so I got to do that. And so, that'll be special at his graduation, something different that I didn't do with my older son. The more I learned about, the culture and, different things, I feel like I try to pass those on. And, he is proud. He's like, "Oh, when it all happened, he was very young. And he's like, when do I get my card?" Like, he's like, "I'm going to wear it around my neck on a necklace." And he was very excited. And then I had to tell him, "I'm sorry, son, like, you don't get to get a card." Like, that was like soul crushing for me because he was so excited. He's always been very excited about his culture. He goes with me to the powwows when I go, because I go to the Chumash ones, or, the one that they have in Malibu. There's, several local ones that we'll go to. And,
Yeah.
so for me, it was soul crushing that I couldn't give him that. But I'm like, at least I can teach him about the culture and, the different things. And he was really close to my dad. And so, he even gave him, his little Indian name and stuff. And so, he does have that culture. My older son, not as much, but like he did get the classes when he was younger, but then he went to a private high school, so he didn't get it in high school. So when he was older, he didn't really get that offered to him. So, I try to instill that in them, and I think, they know that it's important to me and it was important to my dad. And it was, they didn't meet my grandmother, but they know the stories. So I think as long as I keep instilling those things in them, like it'll be a part of who they are as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean,
Mhm.
everything except for the question is a little hard when he.
Yeah.
But I mean, but that goes to the heart of why I feel it's important to sit and to be able to share stories with
Right.
individuals such as yourself, because at surface level, where the rubber meets the road, people are tasked with figuring out what it is that they're going to raise their children to represent or to stand for, or what parts of their heritage do they want to expose their children to.
Mhm.
And earlier you made mention, that uneasy talk about, someone being half or being biracial, or,
Mhm.
and all those things, are just symptoms
Yeah.
of a larger thing that happened a long time ago when they came up with the one drop rule and decided
Right.
all these things. And so, I understand it, but it's just great to see. that when young people have an opportunity to learn something about themselves or something that is shared within their community or culture, it really, really creates a sense of pride and
Yeah.
ignites them, and those are the things that they carry on that become traditions. You reflect
Mhm.
on the things that
Right.
were deposited into you that made you feel good. And then you say, well, when it's my turn, I'm going to, in kind, give my children the opportunity to have the same. So you're just now, highlighting how culture is passed on and how ideas and things like that can live forever. So, as we get in closer to a close, because I do want to honor your time, I
Mhm.
have just a couple more questions, but I want to kind of turn this to a more of a positive and optimistic type of
Mhm.
vibe. When you think
Yeah.
about the future of Native communities,
Mhm.
locally or anywhere in the United States, what gives you hope?
Mm. What gives me hope? Um, is that, that native voices and stories are being heard, like, situations even like this, I appreciate, you taking the time to like let me talk about my story and what it means to me, things like this, social media, and I know we kind of talked about it a little bit with the young people, like if it didn't happen, social media didn't happen, right? And so even though like not everything on social media is great, we know that, but it also gives people a platform. Like I was saying, I follow a lot of Native American, influencers on TikTok and Instagram who share stories of their culture. Or, I follow one gal who's a jingle dancer, and I follow her to like to all the powwow she goes to, and now she's doing classes like to show people online how to do jingle dancing. And there's all these beautiful things, that gives me hope that, and that the younger generation and that people are able to express themselves and show those types of things, and, are being recognized, just like as people, as like, educators, as actors, as, activists, all those things. That's what gives me hope, is that, people care, people want to hear our stories. Like, it meant a lot that you reached out to me to, do this, and, I joke around a lot. I have a good friend of mine, Kim, who we kind of joke because she says, well, my great great grandparents came over on the Mayflower and you're Native American, and we're like the best of friends, like, but things like that give me hope. It's like we don't care that, I mean, we care, about our ancestors and where we came from, but like that doesn't, stop us from being good friends. Excuse me, we we look at those things like, look at us, look at what's happened, over time. Like, it's amazing. And that's what gives me hope, is that, that one day, like, hopefully, that people will recognize that everyone is important, where you came from is important, and not only that, but what you're gonna do, like how you're gonna live your life.
Yes. And that actually kind of bleeds into the final story, I mean, question that I was going to.
Oh, I lost the sound.
Uh-oh.
Oh, there you are.
There you go. Sorry about that.
Okay. No, it's okay.
Okay. Okay, so the last thing that I wanted to ask you, just to kind of bring it all full circle, because again, I feel very honored that you felt it necessary to be able to come and share your story. There's a certain level of vulnerability and trust that has to be there to sit down with a person that's going to ask you questions that can be looked at and scrutinized, and people can make any and every assumption just based on what you shared or what you didn't share. But
Right.
at the end of these type of things, I always want to make sure that I provide a space for the interviewee to be able to just now reflecting upon what we just talked about and just taking into account that this is just a sliver of who you are. We've only just scratched the surface of who you are and your experiences have been. But what you've shared so far has been very, very eye-opening and very profound to me. What do you hope listeners take away from understanding your story and the stories of your community and what we talked about today?
Well, I just hope, my hope is that, this conversation and other things maybe that I've mentioned will open, people up to more understanding, maybe respect and, that connection, because Native American people are very about connection, connection to the community, connection to the land, Mother Earth, that's a big thing. So if this conversation inspires, just one person to learn more and understand, more, have compassion, I want to build a strong community, with people. And I think if this, gives anybody that little hope of lifting each other up, that's my hope, I guess, is that it just inspires other people to have that respect and connection.
Excellent, excellent. Well, you have one. You already have one person that is going to be forever changed from this because I'm going to be able to take this experience and, go and do further research and then also be able to just share pieces of what we discussed with our students. And as an educator, the one magnificent part about our job is that we have an opportunity to kind of help to unlock and shape the minds of
Yeah.
young people
Mhm.
and to get them to be able to take this thing that seems to be heavy with us and to remove it from them in the future and make this a better place. And it starts with, just being able to have more opportunities to engage all voices. And so I
Mhm.
just want to say in closing that your voice is valuable. You are a valued member of multiple communities. It's always been a pleasure to be in your presence and to see you around students and even to see you in the administrative capacity when I would stop by the school and ask you, what's the differences, what's the pros and cons. I mean, you always still stayed and registered at the frequency in which I met you at. So it's good to see that this job hasn't beat you down, it hasn't deterred you or dimmed you in any way.
Oh,
You're
mhm.
still very much the same person that when I walked into your room and shook your hand, it was like, okay, I have an ally in the room. And so
Yeah,
I want to thank you for being vulnerable enough and for sharing your perspective and sharing your insights. And hopefully, this is one of many opportunities for us. I'm indebted. If you need me, I'm a text or a phone call away. You know that.
thank
And so
you.
I just wanted to say thank you for taking time to sit down and to share your story with us.
Of course. No, thank you. I appreciate you.
All righty. So there you have it, folks. This is another opportunity to be exposed to and then peel back a lot of layers from the surface level of things that we've, maybe internalized or just been totally dismissive about as it pertains to the Native American community. It's not just those people that are somewhere else on a reservation. We have people that are card-carrying members of lots of nations among us, and they are able to navigate in multiple spaces, but it's always great to see when they're able to still stay true to themselves because it helps us out, right? I feel like any culture, not just Native American or Indigenous culture, not just cultures from different places, but any culture is worth archiving, and it serves as a way for people to be able to see glimpses of the past still present. Because again, these traditions are passed down. We have opportunities to gain understandings, put to bed misconceptions, and to grow as people. So again, thank you for your time. So until the next episode, hopefully you guys take something from this. Hopefully this has cleared up some misconceptions. Or if you are part of an indigenous tribe or you have family members, but you haven't felt the courage to go and explore and figure out how you can get involved in those communities. If you do have family members who are from a lineage, don't be deterred from having paperwork that doesn't reflect that. As you heard here, with a little bit of due diligence and a lot of preparation, you can go ahead and insert yourself into tribal life. And even if I would assume, even if you don't have a particular tribe to call your own, there is pathways to be able to at least go and to educate yourself and to figure out more about your local tribe so that they're not just that place where you get fireworks from or that place where you just go gamble, right? There's so much more to these various tribes and cultures. So until the next episode, thank you very much. We're out.